Hello everybody, Glass Half Dead here, and today we're going over the top 3 rules I see people getting wrong. I won't be covering any hotly contested wording or rules that are still open for debate. Everything here is 100% what the rulebook says, no room for interpretation. Now, why am I making a rules you get wrong 1 year into the life of the game? Well, I've been to a lot of tournaments recently, played a lot of games against new people, and I noticed these rules still get confused. You may think you know how these basic rules are played, but I implore you to spend the time just to make sure you really are correct. Also, at the very end of the video, I'm going to give you guys a real challenge. Jump to the timecode on screen now, hopefully, if I've remembered to edit this video, to see if you can figure out every rules interaction to what I consider to be the final end boss of Kill Team rules interactions. A quick note before we get started, however, this first rule is one that people often home rule to be different from what the rulebook says, and that's no problem at all. However, if you go to a tournament, expect it to be ruled the way I am describing now. Personally, I like the rulebook way, as like it or not, it is clear. And first up, we have line of sight rulings, including Arena. Now, I've actually devoted an entire video to this subject before, but since then, there have been plenty of new players joining the game, and Arena has been released. So, how does line of sight and obscurity work both in and out of Arena? On screen here, I think this is a nice obvious one. Not much explanation needed. There are no penalties. Now, this model is clearly obscured, so this is nice and easy. But if we move it slightly, things get a lot iffier. However, in all of these pictures, the model is still obscured because any part of the main body being obscured will give the negative to your shot. It needs to be noted that you never ignore terrain. It doesn't matter if you're within 1 inch of a wall. If you can't draw a line of sight from your model to the enemy, then no shooting. The 1 inch rule is a mistaken rule held over from 40k, I think even 7th edition 40k, I'm not sure about 8th, and has no effect when it comes to line of sight. It does affect another rule coming up later, but not line of sight. Now that's all pretty simple, but let's get into the more complex situations. This may seem obvious to you, but this is the one that I see ruled incorrectly most often. In this configuration, both models are at -1 to hit, even though you are able to draw line of sight from any part of the model, which includes the tip of the gun or antenna or cool looking banner. The rules for what counts as obscured read, when checking to see if a target is obscured, consider the main body of the firing and target models. To reiterate, when checking whether or not a model is obscured, you check from the main body of the firing model. This does not include the model's weapons, aerials, etc. You could draw line of sight from these sticky out bits, that's a technical term, but if the only part of your model that can see the enemy is a part that in the reverse situation would mean you count as obscured, then your shot will grant the enemy the obscured bonus. Remember, where you can draw line of sight is different to what counts as obscured on your model. This model is obviously obscured because the enemy's feet are always obscured if the terrain they're standing on is higher than the height of your model. Now let's cover Arena. There's not much to say here, but it is very important. Some think that because Arena is considered the competitive side of the game, the line of sight rules were replaced so that your model is effectively just your base and the model doesn't count anymore. Allow me to dispel that notion by reading the first line of the Arena visibility rules. In addition to the usual rules for determining if one model is visible to another. These rules are in addition, so everything we just covered still applies, but we now consider the model's base as well. So this is nice and easy, as you can see all of the enemy's model's base and model. No issues here. Now the base is fully visible, but don't forget that these rules are in addition to the standard line of sight rules. So even though you can see the entire base, you will still be shooting at a -1. Okay, a very similar setup, but even though you can draw line of sight from the tip of the gun being covered doesn't count as obscured as it's not part of the model's main body. There is no -1 for shooting in this scenario. We can't see the base at all here, but again, This is in addition to the standard line of sight rules. In this scenario, it doesn't matter how much of the model we can see, part of the base is obscured. So it's a -1 to hit. I think you get it by now, but I'm gonna say it again. Even though you can't see any of the enemy's base, because you can see part of the model, you can still take a shot, but obviously at a -1 to hit. And that's line of sight done. It's easy and intuitive when you think about it, and the rules are very clear on every situation. A common complaint I hear is, why does shooting my model's gun kill him? In my mind, from a narrative perspective, your models are never actually standing still. They're always in motion, running and gunning, diving all over the place. That gun barrel is really them peeking their head round a corner, and that antenna is them jumping over a piece of rubble at just the wrong time. Injury rolls. I like to think that injury rolls are simple, but fast rolling is complicated. When rolling an injury roll, you look at the damage of your weapon, and if you remove the enemy model's final wound, you roll that many dice, and on a 4+, they are removed from the game. It couldn't be simpler. Let's try a few examples. A bolt gun. We all know the classic bolt gun. It has a damage of 1, so it's a great example. You fire 2 shots because you're within half range of the enemy. You hit twice. Don't forget all of the obscurity bonuses from the previous rule, of course. You wound with both shots. The enemy fails both of their armor save rolls. It's the injury roll. What do you roll? 1 dice. Why not 2? The way Kill Team works is that every attack goes through its full sequence before a second attack occurs. Even on a rapid-fire weapon, technically, you should roll 1 dice to hit, then to wound, then the armor save, then an injury roll. If that fails at any point in the sequence, you then roll your second dice. However, there is a rule in the book called fast rolling, which says that you can roll all of your attacks at once for the sake of not slowing down the game. All you need to remember is that once you get to the injury roll, no matter how many attacks made it to that point, technically, only your very first attack actually did, and the other attacks never happened. On a 1 wound model, that is. Remember, an injury roll only occurs when the final wound is removed from the model, and you can only ever make 1 injury roll per weapon. Thanks to elites, more and more models these days have multiple wounds, and that makes things more complicated. So now we have the basics covered, let's look at other examples. An intercessor versus a bolt gun. If 1 shot goes through, there's no injury roll. If both shots go through, because the bolt gun is only 1 damage, you roll a single dice. An intercessor versus a rail rifle in half range. 2 shots make it through. Now both of these shots are D3 damage, so what do we do here? Let's slow it down and take it back to basics. Really, only 1 of these shots has hit at this point. So, you roll 1 dice to determine what the damage of the first shot to hit was. If you roll that it was 1 damage, then the intercessor takes a single wound. Because he's not reduced to 0 wounds, no injury roll occurs, and that means the second shot would have been taken. So, you roll the damage for the second shot as well. As the intercessor only has a single wound left, any roll here will result in an injury roll, and we follow the original rule of how to determine how many dice to roll for an injury. If we roll a 6 on our dice, that means our weapon is 3 damage, so we roll 3 dice for the injury roll. Which brings us to injury rolls with multiple dice. Now this is nice and easy. Roll the number of dice equal to the damage of your weapon, in this case that's 3 dice, and then you pick the highest number that you rolled. If you roll below a 3 even on 3 dice, that means the intercessor takes a flesh wound and is then returned to having a single wound, so he can continue being on the board until that wound is removed by the next attack and he takes an injury roll again. Now, notice that every time I've mentioned rolling injury dice, I've said that you roll the injury dice. That's because whoever is dealing the damage gets to roll the injury dice. Generally, that means your opponent will roll injury dice as part of his attack on your models, and you'll roll injury dice for his models as part of your attack. The reason this is important is because a reroll only allows you to reroll your own dice. Your opponent cannot force you to reroll the injury roll that takes his model out of action. But remember, whoever is dealing the damage rolls the dice. If you fall off a building, Perils of the Warp, or Savior Protocols yourself, then the player that owns the model will roll the dice as they are the one inflicting the damage upon themselves, and so will have the option of re-rolling a failed injury roll. Also, when re-rolling an injury roll, you must re-roll all of the dice. This is especially important against Necrons. But wait, there's one more factor to consider. I mentioned earlier that being within 1 inch of terrain doesn't affect line of sight, and that's true. However, being within 1 inch of intervening terrain will give your opponent a -1 to the injury roll. Normally, your model is killed on the roll of a 4, 5, or 6. If you are within 1 inch of terrain that is obscuring you to the attacking model, whatever they roll has a -1 modifier. That means their roll of a 4 actually becomes a 3, and so doesn't take you out of action. And to go back to the line of sight rules, if they are on a floor above you and obscured, then they are definitely within 1 inch of terrain. They're stood on it, right? And so the advantage of having the high ground is starting to make sense, hopefully. And that's it. The injury roll is, again, actually very simple once you ignore fast rolling. Feel no pain. Feel no pain saving rolls. Logically, this section should have been before the injury roll section, but you're always going to be making injury rolls. Not everyone is going to be making feel no pains. So, who gets feel no pains? When do you take them? How do they affect your injury roll? Firstly, feel no pain is an overarching term for all saves that come after a wound is successful, and it's a hangover from 40k 7th edition when they had universal special rules. Those no longer exist, and in fact, you won't actually see the phrase feel no pain anywhere in the core Kill Team manual. All of these rules now have different names, but have essentially the same effect. You will mostly hear it from Disgustingly Resilient, thanks to the entire Death Guard team getting it. But a lot of factions get access to the same role through faction abilities. Drukhari all have it, but it's called Inured to Suffering. Admech priests call it Fanatical Devotion, etc., etc. You get the idea. A Feel No Pain is a roll that comes after the armor save, but before the injury roll. At that point, you are, from a rules perspective, Schrodinger's model. You have both taken a wound and not yet taken a wound. But let's not get philosophical because of poor rules writing. Feel No Pains are based on damage taken, not hits. Pretty simple really, but let's dig in a bit and give some examples. Our trusty bolter shoots at half range, managing to hit and wound with both shots. You fail both armor saves. Keeping in mind injury rolls and fast rolling, how many Feel No Pains do you roll? Well, it's 2. Because you haven't actually taken a wound yet and been reduced to 0 wounds. Again, we're starting easy. But let's go back to the ever-complex rail rifle. At half range, it's a rapid-fire weapon, so it hits with both, wounds with both, and you fail both armor saves. So you have 2 D3 shots having gone through your armor. Again, ignoring fast rolling, this is pretty easy. One of the dice goes to the side because that shot hasn't technically happened yet. You roll your D3 for the damage of the first shot. Let's say you roll a 2, enough to take any 1 wound model out of action, but perhaps you're shooting a grotesque, a 4 wound model. How does this work now? Firstly, remember that Feel No Pains have nothing to do with the injury roll. They are simply a chance to stop any wound from being lost, not just your final wound. So, you've rolled a 2 for your damage. You then take the value of your model's Feel No Pain, typically either a 5 or a 6+, and you roll the number of dice equal to the damage dealt by the weapon, in this case, 2. If you save both, then no damage is done, and you repeat the process for the next shot in exactly the same way. However, let's say you fail one of the saves, and it removes your final wound. You saved one of the damage, but when it comes to the injury roll, the damage characteristic of the weapon is still 2, so you would still roll 2 dice for the injury roll. But what about on that big 4 wound grotesque? You saved 1 damage, but 1 went through. But the damage characteristic of the weapon was 2, so you only lose a single wound. The damage characteristic of the weapon only matters when it comes to the injury roll. So in the case of the grotesque, you would then take your second shot and roll the damage for that and follow the same process. The grotesque has 3 wounds left, so let's say you roll 3 damage on the next shot. Well, you have to fail all of your feel no pain saves to get to an injury roll. Save even one of them and you won't lose your last wound, so don't get to the injury roll. But if you fail all of them, then the damage of the weapon was 3, so you would still roll 3 injury dice. And here's a bonus 4th rule for everyone. A comms specialist cannot comms themselves. That was specifically FAQ'd. Likewise for Auspex and Omnispecs, they both specifically state that you can only give the effect to another model within 3 inches. Okay, now let's go all out and get crazy with an example. A D6 damage weapon against a crisis battlesuit that is within 3 inches of both a Guardian drone and a shield drone and is within 1 inch of terrain. Give your answers to the full interactions to this rule in the comments. You can read other answers before giving yours, of course, but keep in mind that those answers might not be correct. Challenge yourself to that mental mind twister and don't be afraid to listen back to any portions of this video if you need a refreshing of these rules, because this video turned out to be a lot longer than expected. But I wanted to be thorough and create a video that would stand the test of time and be a thorough reference for everyone. Anyway, this has been Glass Half Dead, hoping you've had a good day and continue to have one, and hoping that this video has increased your rules knowledge by at least just a little bit. Goodbye.